As a bass fisherman, fishing large expanses of grass flats and lily pad fields is probably one of the hardest things to do because finding the fish is simply super hard. But if it's done right, you can absolutely hammer them.
Got him. Yep. There's a good one.
So in this video, we will talk about what to look for, what baits to throw, how to catch them, and how to catch more fish than you ever thought possible. So in this video, we have two different types of flats that we're encountering. We have a lily pad field, and then we also have hydrilla flats, both of which I break down the exact same way, but the baits that I do it with are going to be a little bit different. They're very similar, but they're a little bit different. So we'll talk about some of those differences as we get into this. The water temperature for both of these scenarios is in the low 70s, so it is post-spawn. Things change a little bit when you get into the spawn, and so going into that was what I was taking into account for. So starting out on this trip, I started with a white and chartreuse chatterbait because it's a great moving bait when I'm fishing around sparse pads. And what I did was I got on the edge of the pads. There was a channel that was cut through it, and so I was working my way out into the pads to try to get out on the outer edge of the pads. Now I was assuming there was some kind of shad spawn with that water being in the low 70s, and so that's why I started out with a chartreuse and white chatterbait. And a bait like that is just really good when you're in sparse pads because it actually works really well through the pads without getting too hung up. And if there's any mixed hydrilla, you can also get good reaction strikes out of that. And right here, I hook a small keeper right off the bat. It only took a couple. I was probably fishing for 5 minutes. But that was a good clue as to, that they will eat that bait. And so even though I didn't end up catching a ton of fish on a chartreuse and white chatterbait, it just let me know that they will indeed eat that bait. And so maybe I just need to switch up to something that was a little less noisy, and that's why I switched to this swim jig, which is probably one of my absolute favorite baits for covering water through thicker cover like these pads. So once the pads started to get a little thicker, you can see the hydrillas coming up a little bit more. That's why I switched to this swim jig. So what do you look for when you're going through a big pad field like we have out here in front of us? The first thing that I like to do is I like to hunt right for the edges of it. The edges are where I usually like to start, but knowing that these fish were post-spawn and not far off of the post-spawn, I started on the edge, but I didn't stay there very often. After that, I was looking for irregularities on the inside of the pads. That could be anything from isolated groups of pads to ditches in the pads. Specifically, you look for pads that aren't as developed. And because when you see pads that aren't as developed, that tells me that water's a little bit deeper and it takes longer for those pad stems to shoot up. The more developed the pads are in those areas, the shallower the water is because the faster the sunlight penetrates through those areas. So right here you can see I'm inside the original edge of the pads on another secondary edge. And so what I'm doing is I'm trying to figure out where those fish are setting up, the depth of the pads, whether they're all the way up along the bank, whether they are out a little bit further or on that outside edge. And so I'm using these moving baits like this swim jig to figure that out, because if there's a group of fish there, odds are I'm gonna get bit on a moving bait first, and then I can go back through and slow down a little bit later. But first, right off the bat, I need to start with something moving to give myself a clue as to where those fish are going to be. And so that's why I'm keeping the swim jig in my hand. I have this rigged up on an Arc Invoker Tour Series 7.4 medium heavy moderate. I have it on 50-pound braid. I like the 50-pound Cortland Masters silent flip because what that allows me to do is cover water better because I can cast that bait a little bit further. But that swim jig was just a little bit more silent, but that white was because it was a little bit still of a shad spawn going on. We had overcast conditions, and so that's why I picked up this specific bait to try to cover that water. As I was moving along this edge, I'm throwing it on the edge, and right there you can see I get absolutely hammered by a smaller fish, but that's a good sign for me to know that there's a group of fish in that area.
Lit that little guy up on that swim jig. Now we'll put another waypoint right there, kind of give us an idea as to where, there's a starting and a stopping point maybe. We got a couple bites right in this small area. We could go back through flipping a Senko or something a little bit slower just to see.
Once I start to get a couple bites, especially solid fish, that's when I can start to dissect a specific depth zone or like distance away from the bank that those fish are actually staging up in to know where I need to target the rest of the day to put all of my time in.
Oh, that one choked it. Biggins. Look how he got that swim jig.
So that fish right there kind of showed me that there are quality fish. They're in a specific depth zone near the bank. They're not further out. And so now I could start to dissect where those fish are really at and kind of break down that specific area and get on a line and start to cover that shallower zone because those fish hadn't moved all the way off the bank yet. So before we get any further in the video, let's talk about the baits that I'm specifically using and why I'm using the baits that I'm using. Because when you're fishing hydrilla versus when you're fishing pads, there's a lot of crossover, but there's also some mismatch to it. And so some of the first baits that I'll talk about will be for the hydrilla and the baits that overlap. And the overlapping baits are going to be a swim jig and then a chatterbait. Those are the two that really overlap for me, as well as a topwater frog. That also overlaps because the reaction you get when you're fishing sparse pads and hydrilla with a chatterbait is basically unrivaled. Now when that starts to get a little bit thicker, as well as when the pads get a little bit thicker, a swim jig does a phenomenal job, especially when there's a lot of pressure in your area. So that's kind of one of the things that I base these two off of. If I'm fishing sparse or areas that I don't think anybody's fished, I'm gonna go with something that has more vibration, a chatterbait and even a spinnerbait. Something that's gonna give me a lot of motion, a lot of commotion, and something that's gonna call those fish out to where I can break that down a little better. Now, if I see a lot of other boats in the areas or that cover starts to get a little thicker, that swim jig starts to play immensely. You know, I'll start out with a white in the morning, a white and chartreuse, but then as that sun comes up, if the sun comes up, I like to go to something a little more natural. That's where that green pumpkin will kind of play in, that bluegill color. But those are the baits that really overlap. When you get matted hydrilla, or you get really thick pads with openings in them, that's where the frog starts to come into play for me, because when I throw that frog, I'm kind of covering the matted vegetation where those fish might be hiding underneath of it, where you can call them up through and get some crazy explosions on some mats, or you can kind of cover the pads a little bit. The only thing that's different is when I'm fishing pads, I like to throw a popping style frog, versus when I'm fishing hydrilla, especially matted hydrilla, I like to go to a pointed nose frog because it just comes through the hydrilla a little bit better. If I'm fishing sparse hydrilla, I will throw the poppin' frog because it will call them up out of it. Now, the baits that I like to throw in pads that doesn't really play in hydrilla is going to be this is a Z-Man Toads, and it's just a soft plastic floating toad that I can put a weedless hook in there to cover over top of the over top of the pads, because it's gonna call those fish out, and it's super weedless when you rig that on an EWG hook, that chin locks hook that I like to throw, or a dual frog hook. It will come through the pads incredibly easy, and you can cover a ton of water with it. Works great on overcast days and early in the mornings, and a spinnerbait in pads plays for me more than it ever will in hydrilla. If I'm in hydrilla, 9 times out of 10 I'm throwing that chatterbait, but pads, a spinnerbait does a great job because of that 90-degree wire. It actually doesn't get hung up in the pads as easily, and so I can fish a lot cleaner through those pads. And so that's why I like to lean to a spinnerbait. I will flip both of them. Whether it's hydrilla or pads, I like to flip a Z-Man palmetto bug in both of them because it does a great job at catching those fish that are left over.
There's a lot of stuff popping through here. It's getting a little too thick for the chatterbait though, so we're gonna have to dial it back from the chatterbait and go to personal favorite of mine, the old swimmy jig. Throwing that on the same combo though, 7-to-1 gear ratio, G5. Oh dude, something is eating chat up there. 7-to-1 gear ratio Arc G5, and then I'm also pairing that with a 7.4 Arc Invoker Tour Series, and that is a medium heavy moderate rod, and it's actually a composite rod, but it's like super, well, this one's not the composite one, this one's just the regular one. This one is super duper sweet. It just really allows you to get those bites, and gosh, there's so much activity up on that point. We gotta go check that out. There's fish popping all over that point.
So what I was seeing going on this point was it was a shallow point where the grass had been hollowed out, and these largemouth had pushed a bunch of shad that had spawned up into this shallow pocket, and that is where there was a ton of fish piled up. So what I did first was I was throwing that swim jig because the grass had been thicker all the way around this point, but then when I got up onto it and realized it was that shallow, I was able to catch one quick, and then I had to switch baits to really dial in these fish.
He's coming straight at me. Internal compass might have been a little bit right. Little baby one. A little baby one, but gosh, it gagged on that swim jig. It choked on it. Let's try that again. See if maybe there's not a wad of them up there. That'd be pretty wicked. Haven't been able to find a good wad of them on a swim jig yet. Oh, I got clobbered. Had one absolutely smash it.
The cool thing about these shallow points around the shad spawn is that the fish use the top of the water as a surface to pin bait fish against, which is why a topwater works so well, because it looks like a fleeing bait fish that has nowhere else to go and they almost can't help but eat it. So a topwater such as this 6th Sense catwalk is a great bait to pick up this time of year.
Hoo-hoo. Oh, he missed it. Oh, he missed it. There. Oh, oh, they're all over it. Eat it. That one got it. Oh my gosh. That one finally got it. Oh, them the ones you gotta watch out for right here though. Golly, I knew there's a bunch of them up there. Choked that thing. Gosh, they were blowing up on it like mad. Oh my gosh. Not a big one, but a decent one. Let's see if there's more of them up there like that. Come on, baby. Where are you at, girl? Oh, that was a giant. That was a giant. Oh my gosh. Absolute giant. Oh my gosh, that was a big one. He like missed it the last second. Let's see if he comes back for it. Oh my gosh. I got him. I got him. Oh my gosh, it's a giant. Oh, that's a freaking big one. Oh, that's a toad, dude. He's gonna jump. Oh, oh, big ones, baby. Big old topwater to the face, dude. It doesn't get any better than that. I told you there was fish blowing up on this point. Oh my gosh. That is a straight beast. Let's see how big it is, boys. Let's see how big she actually weighs. Oh, that's a big one. That's 4-pounder all day. 403. Oh, that's a big one. That's what we were looking for right there. Oh, oh, big old post spawner. Oh, that was so sick. Bomb it out in there. Got him. That's a good one. Come on. Yeah, that's a good one. Whoo-hoo. Oh, he got it right across the top of the head right there. Oh, that was sick. Another one up there. Oh, that was so sick. Oh, that was sweet. Sweet. And again, I'm throwing that 6th Sense catwalk because it sits lower in the water. And I just got it in bone color because it's overcast today. There's not a lot of wind, but it's just cloudy. You know, we're like it's just gonna rain. Throwing that on straight braid. I don't like to use a leader with my topwaters. I know some people do, but I don't. Got a loop knot tied on there. And then this is Cortland 30-pound master braid.
I got it in a tan color so I can see it a little bit. That 30 pounds so I can cast it. If you'll notice the rod when I'm fishing that, I got it on a really soft rod, just because those fish, when they're popping it out of the water trying to eat it, that soft rod kind of dummy proofs it for me, because when they eat it, as I lean, they get a chance to come up and go down with it before I can really set the hook on them. So that's why I do that. And I got it on an 8-to-1 Arc G5 reel. There's an Arc Essence rod. I'll have it linked down below like always. But yeah, that way that 8-to-1 I can really bomb that topwater and burn it back real fast when they're really trying to eat it. But we're gonna throw back up in there and try to get another one. So the key when you're fishing these hydrilla beds and these lily pad fields is looking for irregularities. I've kind of alluded to covering the edge and working my way in, but what you really want to notice is if there's any depressions, if there's any high spots, all of the little things that really come into play. And a great way to use this is to look at Google Earth when the water is lower or clearer, and you can dial it back over the time periods to see that. Another way to do that is just with the depth finder on the front of your graph. You can also do it by just plain fishing. All of these are really good ways to figure out how to find these different irregularities in here. It's easier with lily pads because a lot of times you can just see it with your eyes. As I talked about, the lily pads that are further along, that water's shallower. The lily pads that are further back, that's a little bit deeper water because it takes longer for those to come about, and oftentimes it leads to harder bottom. The same thing can kind of be said with hydrilla or grass flats in general. You'll see it this time of year that grass is far enough along that you'll see areas where it's topped out and you'll see areas where it's not. A lot of times those areas where it's not is going to be where those fish are really concentrated. The next thing you need to focus on are points. Whether it's points in the lily pads, points in the grass, and then bellies. Look for anything that bait fish are going to congregate on, any of these different edges. That's going to be the real key. These bass want deeper water that they can sit in to ambush their prey, which is most oftentimes bluegill or shad. That's just what it comes down to be. And so a lot of the times I use the moving baits that you see here to catch these fish, and then I will slow down with slower moving baits like flipping, throwing a Texas rig Senko, a lot of these other baits to catch these fish, but you first have to find them. And that is the biggest thing that I've talked about in this video, is utilizing these moving baits to really cover the water and figure out where these fish are at. Because as you've seen, once you do find them, a lot of times you find big groups of fish, and that's what makes grass flats and these big lily pad fields so attractive to fishermen, is because they hold these big wads of fish that seemingly vanish, but then when you find them, it can be some of the best days out there on the water that you've ever had. And so you need to look at these little irregularities to really figure out where they're at. One of the other things that you need to focus on is the types of vegetation that are present. A lot of times you'll have areas that have straight lily pads, and then you'll have hydrilla or some other type of grass mixed in. That's key because you want to look and figure out whether they like that mix of vegetation for that time of year or whether they want clean bottom. Around the spawn, they typically want clean bottom, but then as you get later into the post spawn, they want something with more mix of vegetation. And the same thing can be said with hydrilla. A lot of times when you find a mix of vegetation, that's where you really start to find your biggest population of fish, because it provides the most mix of species in there, whether it be bait fish that are feeding on it, aquatic insects. A lot of times it produces the most oxygen. It gives those fish the most cover possible, because once you get that mix, you get a lot of different backgrounds that those fish can really blend into. For those of you guys that have straight lily pads, even if there's no vegetation, that's where you need to focus on the bottom depth the most. That's where I will graph the entire line of lily pads. If I say I want to fish this patch of lily pads because this is where they're going to be, then I will graph the whole bottom edge of the outside of it and look for the depressions and try to find those little bit deeper areas. For where we are right now, what I was looking at was I was looking for spawning bays in particular, and then I was dialing it back from there. I said, okay, these fish had to spawn in here. Now they're trying to leave there to get out toward the main lake more. Where can I intercept them with? And that was the biggest key for me, was finding the edges that were nearest to where those fish had spawned. It was an inside edge. They weren't really far away from where they had spawned, and so I was just trying to intercept them from there, utilizing the tips that we've talked about with the different mixes of vegetation, utilizing the different baits that we've talked about to cover that water, Fortunately for me, we had overcast and windy and rainy conditions, so they were willing to eat moving baits all day long. Most times we're not that lucky, so I had a flipping bait. I did keep it honest in some areas where I had gotten a few bites, but it didn't pan out for me. So I was able to keep using those moving baits to keep covering water, to keep catching those fish, doing really fun techniques, but it doesn't always work out that way. So don't let when you go up to a big grass flat or a big lily pad field discourage you. If you take these little tips into consideration, you can really dial it down and break it down a lot faster than you need to. Sometimes it can be really monotonous, though. A lot of times I will put headphones in, listen to music. I've even put Netflix on just so I can tone it out a little bit, because a lot of times you're just making repetitive casts trying to get a bite to figure out where those fish are at. But don't let that stop you. It is some of the most amazing fishing you can have out there. As promised, we are going to end with a good old Bible verse. I got my New Testament and my little mini one here my buddy Ryan gave me. So let's see what one we're going to dial in today. Alright, so today we're going to go with John 19:20. Yet a little while, and the world will see me no more. But you will see me, because I live, you will also live. In that day, you will know that I am in my Father, and you in me, and I in you. And so that's really breaking down that Jesus gave his life for us. He gave the ultimate sacrifice so that all of our sins can be forgiven. He gave that ultimate sacrifice. Everything that you have done is forgiven as long as you, render yourself to Jesus. Everything you have done will be forgiven, and that he is in us and that we are in him, because he's a part of our lives every single day. And we live with such a God that it doesn't matter if you want to be forgiven or not. Like, it's up to you. If you want to be forgiven, you are. If you're not, he's not going to force himself in your life. Okay? So if you seek him, he is there because he's always in you, and you are always in a part of him, because God created us in his image. So hopefully that helps you guys a little bit. If you have any other questions or comments or concerns on the Bible or anything else that we've talked about over the channel recently, feel free to throw a comment below or slide into my DMs. But God bless every single one of you guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.